On a lovely night, I was going to welcome everybody and say thank you for coming out on a rainy day. all good plans. Welcome very much. Thank you for all coming out. And we're here for another Centerbrook Architects Lecture Series presented by the Essex Library. A little shameless self-promotion for the library. We have a book sale this weekend. Anybody going? Book sale? Book sale? Yes. Alexander Johnson in the back has been slaving away for the last 6 months, washing books and pricing them and getting them all pretty and ready. Saturday, the book sale runs from 10 to 5. The library is only open from 10 to 2 if you have library services that you want to use. But the library sale is 10 to 5. Sunday from 1 to 5, everything is half off. So if you dare wait till Saturday, it's half off. Beth Goodnow is not here right now. She ran off to have a nice sunny evening with her husband, but we do want to thank Essex Meadows for providing us with the room and the space and the wine and cheese, the cookies, the plates of food I've seen you gorging on. So thank you very much, Essex Meadows. And we have Rafael Pelli tonight, as promised. I teased him about telling you guys we've been talking about this for a year, right? So he's finally here, Rafael Pelli tonight. One little bit of library trivia with Rafael. He had the smarts to marry an author. Her name is Kay Walbert, and if you've ever read any of her books, I know you've enjoyed them very much. So congratulations to Rafael on his good taste. And we have all of her books at the library in case anybody's interested. We'll provide those. Tonight, my husband Jim Childress, representing Centerbrook Architects, will represent Rafael in his best resume speaking style. So you can hear a little more about Rafael from him. Here he is.
It's very special for me to have Rafael here. He's a partner of Pelli Clark Pelli. Did you work on the Petronas Towers at all when you were young? You know, his dad designed the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur. Those, you know, it was the tallest building in the world. I'm not sure where it stands now. Just beautiful, and they've just gone on to do more and more work and extraordinary stuff. As an architect, you're always a bit competitive, and these guys, I can't compete with. They are phenomenal. Rafael went to Yale, got his BA, then went to Harvard, got his Master's of Architecture. He runs their New York office. And I think what distinguishes him from his father and the older partners is he's very interested in sustainability. And he's really leading the way in doing that in large buildings around the world. He got the first platinum building, LEED platinum building in New York City about 4 years ago, 3 years ago. He really knows what he's doing, and that's what we're excited to hear about how are you doing this, not in your small houses, how are you doing it in a big way for lots of people. So I'm honored to have him here and look forward to hearing what he has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for those kind words. We've always admired the work of your firm and have had a good collegial relationship. I remember coming when I was much younger and I was still working in New Haven, coming up to the great parties that Centerbrook used to throw. They were famous for them, so they were, even for us in New Haven, we would come up to them. And so I always admired the great work, the great residential institutional work you've all done. I'm going to experiment on you all a little bit. This was the title of my talk, so somebody in my office put this together for me. I hope none of you work for Jim Henson or sue me for this, but just trying to inject a little levity into it. As Jim said, I opened up our New York office about 11 years ago, and one of my great interests has always been thinking about the consequences of building and the environment. And I guess I titled this "It's Not Easy Being Green" because I've had the great good fortune to do some projects where the environmental issues were a major goal and aspiration of the design of the building. And the more I learn, the less I feel I know. It's an incredibly humbling process. It points out your shortcomings in so many ways as you get further and further into it, and not knowing nearly enough about the fields of medicine or chemistry, rather, or the fields of really understanding electrical engineering. So it is humbling, but it's fascinating. And what I wanted to share with you was through the design of 3 projects, which are each one very different from the other, some of the things we have learned along the way. And it's really kind of a collection of anecdotes, but there's the obvious things you learn about when you're dealing with environmental issues, but there's a lot of less obvious issues, and some which are completely counterintuitive, which are completely unexpected. So these 3 projects, I should say also, I'm going to be showing you the work which is more purely design work in the traditional sense, the look and the image and character of the building. But a lot of what I'm going to be presenting is the work of many of my great collaborators on these projects, who are engineers, who are energy analysts, who are environmental specialists. So I'm presenting you a kind of a group's work here, which goes far beyond my own, and I want to say that at the outset, even though I won't be crediting them all because it'll take all way too long. So the first project is actually the culmination of 3 projects which we did consecutively, which were done in Battery Park City at the tip of Manhattan. And we had a chance to do 3 residential buildings over a period of 10 years. And we had got a rare opportunity to learn from our own mistakes from each project and sort of go back and look at our own building and say, well, what would we do differently next time? These were all for the same developer, a lot of the same team members on them. The first is called the Solaire, which is a rental apartment building. The second was called the Verdesian, also rental apartments. And the third is called the Visionaire, which is a condominium building, so it's for sale. And this all stemmed out of, and here are images of the 3 buildings. They have very strict design guidelines there in terms of what these buildings need to look like and be red brick. With the final building, we were able to get some variances and do some more interesting things. But we were trying to work within this more traditional vocabulary that they insist on. But this really all stemmed out of, in the year 2000, the Battery Park City Authority, which is a New York State authority, instituted a new set of environmental design guidelines. They got together all these leading environmental gurus from around the state and said, what should we really try to do? They wanted to make Battery Park City a really kind of a trial case for doing green buildings. And this was an initiative of Governor Pataki's at the time. And so we were the first with the Solaire, and we learned a lot about what you can and can't do. But we were the guinea pig, and it was something that was very important in the development community because a lot of developers were incredibly skeptical. They required us to do a lot of things. We had to do a whole gray water treatment plant. We had to do photovoltaic cells. We had to ventilate all the apartments with mechanical air distribution systems, which you rarely do in New York City apartments. So they made us do all these things, and most developers in the city thought, you're crazy, this will never pay for itself. And the great result of this was for a project that got constructed after 9/11, when this area neighborhood was still really kind of on its knees and still just coming back to life, that it rented out immediately. It rented out at a premium beyond what they needed to pay off the additional cost. So one of the big lessons of this, and it became kind of a real case study that was followed carefully in the New York Times and a lot of other publications. And subsequently, another 10 buildings were built according to these guidelines, which were then revised on the basis of this first building. So it was a total of nearly 4 million square feet of construction that got built with these guidelines. And it's really quite a staggering example of educating an industry through government policy. And it included a lot of different requirements. They asked us to submit for what was called the LEED Building Rating Program. At that time, it was a very new thing. Now it has really become the predominant third-party objective measure of the environmental quality of your building. There are a lot of critiques of it, and I think some of them are valid, but it has still become the predominant one. We had a tax credit, which is a New York State initiative, which we were trying to follow for all sorts of economic incentive benefits. And we had Battery Park City's own requirements. Now, all of these things cut across a lot of different sectors, from energy to air to materials, operations and maintenance, how you build the building, water conservation. It really included a lot of categories. But there were a lot of different issues we were trying to deal with in the 3 buildings. That building was very successful, as I said. It led us to do a second building, which was even better. That second building was then the first LEED Platinum building in New York City, and the first residential building to be a platinum building in the country. And it's then led to this third building. So I'm really going to show you more detail about the third building, because this is the one where we kind of put it all together and we were able to do some more fun things. So here's the building here. Very glassy in its appearance from the outside, though it's not as glassy as it appears, in that a lot of this glass actually covers the insulated wall behind it. It is on West Street in Manhattan. It's got a lobby at the corner of Little West Street and 3rd Place. For those of you who know Battery Park City, it actually houses the Battery Park City Conservancy, which maintains all of the parks in Battery Park City. So they've got big manure piles and dump trucks who come in and out of their garage. And it's got a little organic grocery as part of their one retail tenant for the ground floor. Here's a view of the lobby coming into it. It's a nice little green space on the outside where people can sit. The lobby is a wood floor with travertine stone walls. A lot of daylight, very brightly lit, very simple use of materials. With a lot of outdoor spaces at different levels, which were all planted. This is part of this was to try to do green roofs, which are planted roofs, which allow you to both insulate the roofs and to cool them better, because through the evaporation of the plants themselves, they actually cool in the summertime, the roofs. And this is the roof garden itself, looking out over the Statue of Liberty, so it's a nice setting. They do a lot of parties out there. But it does have actually an energy benefit in having so much of it be planted. And the dirt actually extends below all of the decking you see here. And it's that dirt which has this double benefit of both insulating in the winter and cooling in the summer. So this is a plan of the building, which shows you kind of how the odd shape was really derived by trying to have corner units, 4 corner units on every floor that the developer could sell as having river views and views of the Statue of Liberty. It gave us a justification then for these more sculptural expression. The apartments are, again, a lot of natural materials, simple use of materials with nice expansive views out to the river. This is simply a list, of which I'm not going to bother reading to you, of a lot of the different strategies. So far this is pretty much just a conventional design, the conventional design stuff. And here are all of the green roofs. This is looking down on the building from the very top, about how every level, every horizontal surface in this building is kind of treated as an amenity and largely planted. Now, what I wanted to show you now was some of the kind of strategies for dealing with environmental issues and resource efficiency. Now, one of the things, you're going to have to bear with me a little bit, because I have some animations in this PowerPoint. And due to the marvels of modern technology, they're not working properly in my PowerPoint. But if you bear with me, I can actually I can actually run them manually. But you're going to have to just bear with me for a second. So this is describing the water systems in this. We have a gray water treatment plant. All the fresh water comes into the building to a house tank, used for showers, laundry, flushing toilets, and then it goes to a water treatment plant. We treat all of the wastewater in the building. It treats over 30,000 gallons of water a day. That is then mixed with all the storm water, which is also collected. That mixed a batch of water, which after being treated, is then used to send back into the building, and it goes back to the toilets, to the really only the toilets. It's not used in something that's going to be in direct contact with the skin. It's not used for sinks, and it's not used for showers. And the toilet use is only 5,000 gallons of water a day. So where does all that water get used? And that's one of the most fascinating things that I learned about water usage, is that, let me just now put this away and go back to the slideshow. So the fascinating thing about the water usage is, as I started analyzing with the engineers, well, what does this water do? Well, someone using it for irrigating the planting. Well, what about the rest of it? Well, the cooling tower. Well, the cooling tower is this thing at the top of the building which evaporates water as a way to get you a chilling system to help you create air conditioning. And it evaporates somewhere between 15 and 20,000 gallons of water a day. And so what I learned in this conversation with engineers, which I never knew, one of those humbling moments, is the biggest use of water in New York City is for cooling towers. The single biggest use of water in most cities is for evaporation in order to run air conditioning. And if you think about the environment and water as a resource, it's a profound thought, because you think about, over 50% of the world's population lives in cities now. I'm doing work in Sao Paulo and Mumbai, cities of 20 million. And all of these people are going towards more urban solutions. And all of them, and most of them are actually more temperate climates, or even hotter climates, subtropical climates than we are. And they're actually demanding, as part of us, increase the standard of living, more air conditioning. And so you think, the water problem we're talking about in this world is intimately related to the issue of air conditioning and urbanization. And so this strategy of reusing water is fundamental to how we're going to deal with water as a problem in the years going forward. But it's something I never knew until we sort of got into having all these conversations. So here's a view of the building from the river. Now, I talked to you earlier about how glassy this building looks. Now, one of the biggest correlations between an inefficient building, a high energy use building, and the appearance of the building is the amount of glass on the facade. Now, traditional buildings were pretty effective that way, because you knew that instinctively, intuitively. The older colonial buildings had little windows because you lose a lot of heat through them. But modern architecture, modern development, modern marketing wants really glassy buildings. And there's some wonderful features to having very glassy windows in living rooms. So we were trying to balance this objective of having some very glassy open areas of the living rooms, and this very kind of abstract composition with a lot of glass, with the energy consequences of doing that. And this was a back and forth with our energy analysts to come at a percentage of glass that we could do. And the interesting thing is that in the end, these two buildings, while they look wildly different, turn out to be very, very similar in terms of the amount of actual vision glass. And I say vision glass because a lot of the glass you're looking at here is actually called spandrel glass. It's a back-painted glass which is forward of a insulated wall. Instead of having brick in front of it, it's got glass. But it sometimes the appearance belies the actual energy performance. But vision glass is one of those indicators of how much energy you're using. Now these are the spandrel areas. These are actually not clear glass. There's insulated wall behind them, and that's the clear glass above, which shows you how well it can be masked if you have a sort of a very lightly reflective glass. Now, these are actually sort of as if you took a cut through the wall, and you did a digital energy simulation on it. What's interesting about modern technology, one of the things that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is the advance in computer modeling software to allow you to really understand the performance of a lot of things that you want to try to design. So what was interesting on our first project, this is the first time anybody had looked at a traditional brick and block New York construction wall using these techniques. And in fact, these things leak like a sieve. And our client, the owner, actually built a mock-up of it and put it in a wind tunnel testing to see where it leaked like a sieve, so we could try to patch up a lot of those cracks. But we also did it for the new wall. We worked very carefully on the energy performance of that wall, looking at how at how we could make a lot of incremental adjustments to make the wall perform better. We also included a large array of photovoltaics. These are photocells which make electricity. 5% of the building's electricity is generated through the photovoltaic cells at the top of the building, which are integrated into glass panels at the very top of the building. And I think actually look really beautiful because of this kind of stippling textured effect. Now, here's another one of those animations you're going to have to bear with me on. But in the end, when we really try to delve down into the energy use for this building, what was driving the energy use for all of these buildings, these residential buildings we were doing, we found out that what was really killing us was the ventilation. We were bringing fresh air. We were doing all this good stuff with fresh air. We were bringing fresh air. We were bringing outside air in, filtering it, cooling it, dehumidifying it, bringing it to all the apartments, and we had great air quality in all the apartments. But there was a big energy consequence to this because they were running 24 hours a day, even though the buildings were empty a lot of the time. So here's a look at a piece of the building. Take a look at the floor of the building, and that's a typical floor of the tower. And if I take a look at one apartment within that building, what we were having to do is all that little red fairy dust, that's supposed to be hot air being siphoned out through exhaust. New York City code requires you to exhaust a lot of air out of your kitchens and bathrooms as for sanitation measures. But typically you don't supply any air. Well, so now in order to make the building work, we had to supply just as much air as we were exhausting out. That turns out to be an enormous amount of air. And there's a big energy consequence to doing that amount of air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for apartments which are largely empty. So on the second building, what we were able to do was we were able to actually work with the New York City Department of Buildings, and we got approval on a pilot basis to actually downsize the amount of exhaust, and actually working with newer standards and European and Swedish standards for fresh air supply, try to actually balance this from a fresh air supply standpoint, saying this is how much fresh air people really need and what is a good standard for fresh air. And let's downsize the amount of exhaust that we've got through the other ones. And this was accepted and it was still thought to be sufficient for good sanitation practice. Now, it was still running constantly. So what we did finally on the last building was we were able to distribute the air more carefully through the building. We get the air to flow throughout the apartment better. And then finally what we were able to do was we were able to create a sort of a demand-based air ventilation system where you only bring in as much air, a minimal amount of air for the minimal amount of exhaust on a typical basis, but you can actually increase that dramatically at the kitchen exhaust when the kitchen's being used, and then you do a higher exhaust. And then we further were able to do something at the very top of the exhaust stack, at the very top of the building. We're able to put that on a heat recovery system, so we take all of the heat from all the air that's going out. Now, sometimes that's heat, sometimes it's actually coolth, as they call it. You can take the cooling out of it in the summertime so that you can pre-cool a lot of the air that's coming in. But this turns out to have an enormous impact on the energy use for the building. And it was the biggest single variable of the kind of discretionary things we had available to impact the overall energy performance. So, as a consequence, looking at energy, the way actually we're starting to try to look at buildings to understand building energy use better is rather than looking at it as an overall number, which is very hard to compare one building to the other. It's more trying to look at it more using like the car model, how many miles per gallon. It's what's called energy intensity. Energy intensity tells you how many BTU per square foot you're using per year. And actually there is good data from the Department of Energy to create then some baseline so you can understand how your building is performing relative to them. Now this is typical for New York, for a U.S. residential high-rise building. This is what we were able to do on our first building, and this is what we were able to get to on our last building, largely through these ventilation strategies. But it was a pretty dramatic overall performance difference through this kind of investigation and analysis into what's kind of driving the energy use in these buildings. There's an image of the final building again. Now, the other big, of course, environmental question is once you stand back from the building, you're thinking, as a society, if we talk about energy and environmental impact of buildings on our society, you know, anything we're doing on our one building is kind of dwarfed by the difference between 253 apartments here and 250 homes here. You know, it's just land use strategy. It's questions about infrastructure and density. They have you know, by a factor of 10 a much bigger difference in the environmental use and energy use than what we're doing in an urban building. So you know, it's just always trying to keep some perspective on what the real issues are in all of this. Second building is a classroom building for a business school at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. It's a beautiful campus, the University of Illinois campus, with a nice master plan with a cross-axis of green spaces. And this is our building here, which once it was completed, you can see is shaped around this courtyard. And there's a plan of it, which is entrances from the two main streets, 22nd Street and I Street, and around a central common space, which is really kind of a reading room, workroom, because business schools have a lot of 24-hour kind of study sessions, and they wanted a lot of space spread throughout the building where people could work late into the night. This is set up on a Wi-Fi network so people can work on their laptops in groups. An auditorium off at one wing, and these two wings are offices on the ground floor and classrooms up above. And this is a view from within the courtyard of that central space. The main bars of the buildings are brick-clad, much more traditional in their language and relating to the traditional buildings on the campus. But they're all around this one very large, very open, very bright and light open space, which has become such a hit on campus that they're having problems trying to limit the amount of people who use it. It gets used for events a lot of time. People come there from all over the campus to work there late at night, but they can't keep people out of it. It's packed all the time. Here's a view of the space. It's a very beautiful space. It's, again, a wood block floor with acoustic wood panels on the balcony edges, but you can see the amount of daylight that floods in. Now this roof that goes over it is a 30-foot overhang, so that we did a lot of sun angle calculations. It faces due south, so that we can keep the sun out of it during most of the day in the warmer months. In the winter, the sun is lower, and we have actually shades that can come down to deal with glare conditions. But we keep the heat load of the sun out of it during the critical summer months. And it's a very actively used courtyard as well, with a large central staircase to really promote most of the movement within the central stair, within the space. Here's a view from the outside. Again, the outside is trying to be this sort of more solid exterior, which relates to the traditional Georgian buildings in a more contemporary language, with these beautiful limestone entrance panel walls. But these windows are also kind of an energy strategy, because most of the exterior is actually a very low percentage of glass to wall. We have that one central feature of the great common space, but otherwise it's a very, very efficient exterior wall. This is the auditorium space with these windows with closable blinds, which look out onto the beautiful courtyard space. Now, we were able to do a lot of things on this building. This is one of the buildings I'm actually proudest of because our client at the university had no interest whatsoever in doing a LEED building. Kind of skeptical about a lot of the environmental claims being made. But their own facilities group got very interested as I started talking about other projects we had done and other things like the project I showed you before. And they said, well, let's talk about it. Let's at least have, let's have a couple of workshops about it. And they got together all their people, all their engineers from the facilities department. Interestingly, at the University of Illinois, it turns out they had some really, really smart campus engineers who had worked for the U.S. Army Energy Research Department, which was nearby. So they had some people who had actually designed some of the first energy analysis software. So these guys really knew their stuff, and I was with my energy engineers and just sat back and listened for the most part, but as they went back and forth on all these different strategies. But they ended up being very excited and interested. And in a project which had no mandate to do anything with the environmental design, which had no additional budget for doing environmental design, we ended up with the first, and to my knowledge, the only LEED Platinum rated public university building in the country, just out of sheer willingness and interest on both sides. Now, I want to go back to this number because this sort of shows you all the different pieces that make up the energy use for the building. That bottom one, the lighting, turns out to be where we were able to take a lot of our biggest gains. And that's because lighting in a classroom building can be very, very inefficient. And so we did a lot of very low energy use, newer fixtures, but they were also on a lot of advanced control systems. A lot of them are on daylight dimmable ballasts, so that if you bring in a lot of natural light, you don't need to provide more artificial light. So these light fixtures you see here all automatically dim when there's a lot of exterior light. Now, we were able to bring a lot of exterior light in because we have these large clear-story windows, and we have a big shelf here on the inside that bounces light deep into the space. This was a result of an analysis we did. This is showing you a plan of the classroom on both sides and kind of a slightly distorted fisheye view lens, talking about what's called daylight autonomy, talking about how much daylight is falling on every single piece of this classroom. So a big part of this analysis was how much daylight are we getting into the room, how evenly are we distributing it, and how can that then be factored back into the lighting systems, into their systems, so that they're using a lot less energy. And it was really quite remarkable the degree to which that reduced the amount of overall energy in the building. We also did a lot of things with the exterior wall. We had a triple glazed glass system. Instead of normal insulated glass, we have 2 panes of glass. It's actually got 3 panes of glass, very efficient. And we put extra insulation on the exterior wall. Now, when this project was all said and done, I was kind of curious about the relative benefits of a lot of the different things we did. Now, we did a whole photovoltaic array here, the solar cells that I mentioned to you earlier in another project. And they're one of the most visible demonstrations of kind of an environmental energy strategy on the project. But I've always been wondering about what the relative energy benefit is. So I went to our energy analysts, and we sat down, actually even with a cost estimator, and tried to kind of go back and assess the value of the work we did. This system here cost about, we figured, about $750,000. We figured that putting an extra 2 inches of insulation on the exterior wall, which is invisible, cost probably about on the order of $900,000 over the course of the project. So they're not that different, $750,000 to $900,000. But when we did an energy analysis of what the relative benefits were, the amount of energy we saved by doing a better insulated wall with triple glazed windows and making it super energy efficient, as opposed to this photovoltaic array, is sort of, it's a factor of 4. It's a dramatic difference. So these visible technologies, which are kind of the poster child of the environmental design movement, are oftentimes actually nice visual symbols, but not nearly as effective as some of the lower key stuff you might do and some of the invisible stuff you might do. And it's a kind of a necessary to kind of take a step back and look at it with more rigor, how we really approach the problem from the beginning before we get onto these additional technologies at the very end. Now, I also went back as I was sitting around with some of the people we worked on the project, and I said, I'm just interested. So many of the parameters are so set for us because there's standard codes for all of the things that set the energy use in the building, so I asked the question just kind of hypothetically for our building, and I had the energy analyst do some numbers for us. We talk about buildings. Buildings use 3/4 of the electricity in this country. The building sector uses something like 73% of the electricity in this country. It uses only about 35% of the energy in this country, because a lot of the energy we use comes through oil and through cars. So if you separate electricity from energy, it's a different number, but it uses a lot of the electricity in the country. But I was wondering, our codes set the standard ranges of comfort, what people can live in, at a very narrow range. They're at 72 to 75 degrees. If it gets over 75 degrees, it cools you. If it goes, if you go below 72 degrees, the building needs to warm up. And the human being is actually a pretty adaptable species, and somehow managed to survive all of its time on this planet, living far outside of a range of 72 to 75 degrees. And so if you simply set the definition of comfort to be 71 degrees to 76 degrees, you would save 123 million BTUs per year. So, we say the buildings consume this much stuff. Well, the buildings are largely supplying what we are demanding them to supply. And at a certain point, if we really want to affect significant change, we're going to have to look at our own definitions of what's comfort. How adaptable are we? This is the last photograph of the University of Illinois Commons with the staircase. But it actually goes to also the equipment we use, because a lot of the energy use in the building is also set through this little number called plug load, which you never hear about. But it's what sets how many watts per square foot you have in a building. And it's all based on how much our computer equipment needs. And so you're making more energy efficient computers in the end will have this incredibly leveraged effect in terms of the multiplying effect throughout the building. So it's the people, it's the equipment, it's a lot of the stuff in the building that we're setting the criteria for the use of energy within the building finally. So my final project is an office building in Mumbai, India. And it really was my first time in India, my first time in Mumbai, and it's been an incredible learning process. Which I'm still only at the beginning of, even though the project is now under construction. The client did want a LEED Platinum building, which was a nice goal to have from the outset, so it set us with our design team at kind of a high level of aspiration. Mumbai, downtown Mumbai, traditional Mumbai is actually was a series of fishing islands, which then got interconnected by first the Portuguese and then the English to be made into the city. And then connected to this peninsula. The old sort of downtown colonial Mumbai is down here. Mumbai has grown exponentially. It was in the late 40s a city of 7 million. Now it's a city of 20 million people. So my client is this family that owns a very big Indian company called Godrej. Godrej sells a lot of different consumers' goods throughout India. And back in the day, they set up this soap factory in a village outside of Mumbai called Vikhroli. Now today, it's part of Mumbai. Mumbai has grown to it and beyond it, quickly going out well beyond it. So they have this piece of land up here to the north of central Mumbai, but actually rather near the airport. and on a couple of major transportation nodes of roads and of the rail lines going out of Mumbai, which we're desperately trying to kind of hook into so that we have kind of a public transportation infrastructure for this. And here's the main airport, main international airport. They own a lot of land. They own over 400 acres. They have asked us to look at a first piece of 40 acres to transform it from industrial use to a more contemporary commercial use. And this is the aerial photograph of the site we're actually working on now. You can see it's actually a very pleasant place. They have really maintained a good stock of trees. It's actually at the edge of what used to be these great mangrove groves, because it's right at the edge of the bay as it comes in, these saltwater mangrove groves. And they've maintained a lot of the trees. They've actually even started a nursery and have done an active tree planting program around it. We can see how lush these trees all are and how shady that environment is. And one of the things that we're trying to play with and work off of in this master plan. So we have first sort of took an overall look at the overall master, 400 acres, trying to think of how we distribute a series of more open green spaces within it, distribute a series of different uses, create some shuttles and interconnections back to the rail lines, because there's a rail station up at the very end of their land. And we've come up with a master plan for this first 40 acres with a series of buildings around it, a total of 7 buildings, and trying to preserve as much planted green park space as possible, with a lot of the deep shading that it allows, which is so welcome and so necessary in India. Underneath the tree canopy, that central park, which is designed by Balmori Associates. Full disclosure, Diana Balmori is my mother, who is also a landscape architect, who's also been very intensely involved with environmental design issues throughout her life. So this central park is a series of different kinds of surfaces, mostly permeable surfaces, but some for large gatherings and events, and some which are more planted. Here's a simple model of it, of the 7 buildings surrounding all of the green spaces. And it's a phasing plan, which would show you the building we're working on now, the first building, which is a headquarters for the Godrej companies. And then that will be followed by the Central Park, which will be followed by 3 residential buildings, because they want this to be kind of a lively environment around the day and around the week, so it's not purely a commercial environment. There's going to be a hotel here, and then there'll be 2 more office buildings finally. So this is kind of the build-out plan for it. Trying to figure out a mass transportation infrastructure network. India is rapidly going to cars, as much as the developing world is, but is a city of 20 million, they'll never be able to build enough roads to put those cars on. And it's already choked with cars. So the notion that they would put everyone on cars is kind of is sort of doomed to failure, just as we've seen it in many of our cities. And so we're trying to kind of create an infrastructure which allows them to base it on mass transportation, at least while they're still kind of have the parking that they want for their cars. But I think the longer-term goal is India is putting a lot now, billions into the infrastructure of mass transportation to try to expand it, to deal with their densities and their urbanization. We did a lot of solar studies. These are actually studies done by our environmental engineers, Atelier 10, looking at sun angle studies for the overall buildings, where the shading is. And for our first building in particular, it was a very big footprint, which we carved up into sort of 2 main portions with a big central atrium, and did studies showing how we could get as much daylight as possible. These are those daylight autonomy studies that I showed you earlier from the classroom. How do you get the maximum amount of daylight deep into these office floors so that you don't need a lot of artificial lighting, so that your lighting systems can be automatically dimmable so you don't use a great deal of energy. This is a view of the building from the front. We had actually proposed buildings which were not as glassy, but they were determined to have a new Western-style looking building, which had to be glassy. So the compromise is some of this glass is, again, spandrel glass. It's got insulated wall behind it. And we created these large projections, which are over 5 feet in width and in depth, which extend out and do a lot of shading because it's a very high sun in India throughout the year. So we're able to do a lot of shading through these. The atrium space itself is recessed back, and there's these large exterior terraces which provide shading to the central atrium space. You can see here the depth of these overhangs. They're really quite significant and provide a great deal of shading for the office floors. This is one of the entrances from the park side into their lobby. This is a view of the lobby itself. And now I'm going to give you one of those animations again if you bear with me. So this is actually entering into the lobby from the park side with bamboo against one edge, and then there are these stairs and escalators up into the large central atrium space. The side you see to your left, that large atrium window which looks onto the heavily landscaped central space, is facing north. So we were able to have that be kind of the picture window, which looks out into the landscape because it's facing north, so we're able to control the sunlight into that space. This is again a view of the central atrium space. Again, the skylights bring a lot of indirect light. It's all kind of, we've done a lot of studies to make sure we don't get any direct sunlight into it. So we're trying to bring a lot of light into it, bounce it off of a very light floor, but have no direct sunlight into this space. Now, the fascinating thing about Mumbai, several fascinating things, but from an environmental standpoint, resource standpoint, is the great extremes of water. And this is the monthly rainfall in Mumbai. Now, you probably know about the monsoons. So I had some idea that they get a lot of water for a certain time of year. So during the summer, they get a lot of water. They get over 25 inches in July, per month. For these 3 months in particular, drops off precipitously in September. Now, they get more water than they know what to do with. It's a flooding problem. It's a storm sewage problem. How do you get this water out of there? But what I hadn't realized was the flip side of it is for the next 9 months, they don't get a drop of water. They get nothing. And they don't have a way to store it all. They don't have big enough, they don't have the Adirondacks, which New York City has to store umpteen billion gallons of fresh water. So they store what they can, but they have a severe water shortage problem come March, April, May. To such an extent, they don't let their office buildings use fresh water. You're only allowed to treat your own water. You're on your own for those last few months. So designing a building in terms of water usage is quite a thing. They do allow fresh water usage for residential buildings, but not for office buildings. So we had, sorry. I guess my time is up. So we had to calculate how much water we're going to need in this building. And then we created a series of large water storage features throughout this master plan to try to retain water so that we could retain as much water as we could within the site and use it within the building. Now, this shows you how much water we need and the availability of water. And so during the summer, there's plenty of water available. But we want to store as much of it so that we can keep some of it into the drier months when we're still using a certain amount of water. And we went through a really extensive analysis of how do we use less water. We limit the cooling towers. We make more efficient fixtures. We actually maybe try to eliminate the cooling towers through different kinds of systems. We do gray water and black water we use. But one of the things that we found on an energy use standpoint, these are different large water retention tanks throughout the master plan. Some of them which are incorporated into landscape features, some of them which are in the basements of the buildings. But when we kind of looked at it through energy, there was a whole other impact of water, which is back to air conditioning. When you want to do air conditioning, you run these big chillers, and these chillers are connected to cooling towers. And you run big compressors. Now, those compressors are much more effective if they're working off of cooling towers and evaporating water. The evaporation of water is one of the most efficient ways, actually, to cool. If you do an air-based cooling system, which is much more like your window air conditioners, it's like a radiator. You're just running liquid and fluid inside metal, and it's trying to just radiate to the outside, to the air. It is only about half as efficient. So there's a huge order of magnitude difference in the efficiency of your cooling systems if you can evaporate water or whether you can't evaporate water, and you've got to do it through air-based. India, Mumbai, is all air-based cooling systems. Very inefficient. So we've tried to really look at this. Well, let's do a water-based cooling system. Terrific, except for several months of the year, the city's not going to give you any water. So how do you do that? So we actually ended up, we're putting in a desalinization plant in our building. So that, because our groundwater that we get is largely groundwater that's recharged from the bay. It's salt water, but that means there's a constant supply of it. But it's brackish, it's salty. You can't use salty water in a cooling tower. But you can desalinate it in order to evaporate it. Now, you think of desalinization plants in terms of creating fresh water for drinking water, but the issue, as we go back to that one of those earlier points, is, you know, the major use of water in cities is for evaporation. So we ended up doing a desalinization plant in our building so we can desalinate the groundwater and bring it up and run it in a water-based cooling system, and that drove our energy use for cooling way down. And obviously we combined it with a series of other good things to try to get some impacts. But it was one of the most interesting, kind of complicated exercises on this project to understand what the final result needed to be. And here's a view of the building from the park side. Again, this is facing the north side, so that's the more open view into the tower. Very, very simple, just an elegantly composed and proportioned exterior wall. Very glassy as they wanted it, but with large overhangs for deep shading. And that's my conclusion.